Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering thematic walking tours in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director of the company, and I really appreciate you joining us for today's show. Sometime around 400,000 years ago, human beings learned how to master fire. It must have seemed like magic to them to suddenly be able to create light in the endless dark of night. It provided warmth and some safety from the wilds. People have been gathering around fires ever since. Today, telling stories around a campfire is a tradition shared by many cultures around the world. In this episode, we'll be joined by two giants in the field of storytelling. They will share with us some of their favorite spooky campfire stories, give us some tips to better share our own, and consider our unique and amazing gift of creating and sharing stories with each other. Before we get to that, I do have some big news to share. Over the last 6 months, we have seen a huge spike in our downloads, and on behalf of myself and the whole Haunted Talks team, I just want to say how grateful we are for each and every one of you who spend a little bit of your day with us. I also wanted to let you know we have heard your request for more episodes. And this summer, once or twice a week, we will be sharing mini episodes as we swap stories with fellow ghost tour guides from around the world. So be sure to subscribe to the show so you know when these new episodes are coming out. The last Friday of each month will still be reserved for our feature-length episodes. As we move into July, we are running an incredibly full slate of adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and we'd love for you to join us. In addition to all the city tours, you can also join us at Upper Canada Pioneer Village, the Mackenzie King Estate in Gatineau Park, and for the brave, we drop you into your own horror movie at the Seance at Black Creek. The tickets for this authentic Victorian-style seance are starting to be few and far between, so I would strongly recommend securing your spot soon. To buy tickets and for information about all our tours, please visit us at hauntedwalk.com. Podcast listeners always get a 15% discount. Just use the promo code HauntedTalks, all one word, HauntedTalks, at checkout. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media. We are on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk. As you can see, I've already got the campfire going for us, so if everyone wants to gather in and come grab a seat, I do have a story I would like to share. When my brother and I were quite young kids, our family lived for a while in a charming old farmhouse. We loved exploring its dusty corners, climbing the apple trees in the orchard out back. But even now, thinking back on it, there was something sinister about that house. Some mornings, we would wake up and find a cup of water on our nightstands that hadn't been there the night before. We didn't think too much about it at the time, other than we couldn't understand why our parents would never admit to being the ones that had left them there. They always reassured us that it must have been ourselves. We forgot somehow we'd gotten a glass of water before bed, and we had not remembered we had left the cup there on our nightstands. Among the home's original furnishings was a ornate, antique, black wooden chair that we generally kept against the back wall of the living room and reserved for guest use only. It wasn't overly heavy, but for little kids, it was almost impossible to move on our own. One day, while the whole family was eating lunch outside, I slipped back into my room, passing through the living room to get a toy or something, and when I came back through the living room, that chair was now sitting directly in the middle of the room on its side. And I know my brother, at least, had a very similar experience. Years later, long after we had moved out, I found an old newspaper article about the farmhouse's original occupant, a widow. She had murdered her 2 children by giving them each a cup of poisoned milk before bed. She then killed herself. The article included a photo of the farmhouse living room, a room I know so well. And in the photo, with a woman's body hanging from a beam, beneath her, knocked over, was that old wooden chair, placed exactly in the center of the room.
When you're sitting around a fire telling stories, you are at the very beginning and source of civilization. That almost defines how human beings are. I mean, I've often read that animals have enormous capacity of communication, but the one thing they don't seem to do is have a memory of telling you this is the way it used to be. So I have a dog. She's sitting right now at my feet. She can communicate many, many things, but she can't tell me a story about being a dog. I guess she embodies it, but she can't use her language, so to speak, to tell me, what she did 3 days ago or about the squirrel she chased. And human beings sitting around that fire, as we evolved the capacity to tell stories, we were developing memory and imagination at the same time. And it has been said that that's what distinguishes us from all the other animals. We're the storytelling animal.
That is Dan Yashinsky, a Canadian storytelling legend with a tremendously impressive career that includes travel, awards, books, and a radio program. We use some of his concepts and techniques to train our own storytellers.
I became a storyteller at a summer camp called Bolton Camp. It was a family service camp that's no longer there, but in Bolton, Ontario. And it was family service, meaning the kids who came were coming from the poor neighborhoods. When we would go up to the campfire at night, up in the woods just beyond the cabins, I saw something that really changed my life. When I saw the way the boys listened to the stories that were being told around the fire, for me, it was like what I had read about for the Greek bards, the Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, where he would be performing for kings and queens, and they would listen all night long to the epics. Well, to me, seeing my little boys sitting around that fire in the woods just northwest of Toronto was like watching Homer perform for the court of kings. They were such good listeners. And my little kids up at Bolton Camp were just little tearaways. They were hellions. They were the wildest kids you've ever imagined. But when they listened around the campfire, they were transformed by the experience. They just had the most beautiful smiles, and their eyes were shining, and their souls were open. And I thought to myself, wow, this is magic. I don't know how does the camp counselor do it, especially since the stories weren't so, they were kind of your typical summer camp ghost stories. But the boys listened with such attention and reverie that's when I decided I had to become a storyteller. I had to learn how to do that. So I spent the last, anyway, I'm 67 now, so I spent a lot of years trying to learn how from that Bolton Camp campfire. And it's funny because Bolton Camp is gone now. All those little boys that were 8 years old at the time have long since become adults and probably are some of them grandparents by now. Little do they know that watching them listen to the story is what gave me my desire to become a storyteller.
Well, campfires are so wonderfully set. Everyone's very relaxed, of course, which makes you a bit off guard. But the flames are a little bit inherently spooky, and if you're out in the woods, you're surrounded really by the unknown, and it is just a perfect setting to tell a ghost story or any kind of a campfire story. We have stories just imprinted in our DNA. We can't not like stories. Stories are enormously important to human beings and have been ever since we were able to communicate. And we've never lost that, and we likely never will.
That is Barbara Smith, another legend in the storytelling world. She has published close to 40 books on ghost stories, many of them with a Canadian focus. In fact, we sell some of her books in our Ottawa gift shop.
I think we would have to start when I was all of 7 years old, which was a very long time ago. And I was in downtown Toronto with my father. And we passed a huge, big, old, what I would describe now as Gothic building. And it was the bank, a bank of commerce. And my father said to me, they say that bank is haunted. Well, he didn't know what he'd started. So that bank was a bank of commerce. A teller committed suicide in the bank, and she has always haunted that particular bank. But the good Canadian twist to this is that bank is now the Hockey Hall of Fame. And Dorothy, the name of the ghost, she still prowls through the Hockey Hall of Fame. She goes upstairs. She can be heard rustling around. She drives the employees crazy. And children have seen her. Children have stopped in the middle of a tour group, stood stock still, looked up, and pointed. And this one little guy said, "Can't you see her? Can't you see her?" And he described Dorothy. So that one initial passing comment, really, by my father, they say that bank is haunted, that kind of triggered the whole thing. And then I went on to, the Nancy Drew books that were the Phantom of the something or other, and I hated those because it always proved there was no ghost in the end. And then I began to hear true ghost stories and loved them. And I always wanted to write. I've known since I was 5 years old that I wanted to write books. And ghost stories kept coming into me, and I thought, let's give this a go. Ghost Stories of Alberta was published in 1993, and 37 books later, I'm still at my career. I love history, and I love mystery. And ghost stories are just the perfect combination. And I think that's what's kept me going and kept me fresh all these years.
We just like ghosts, so we like stories that have mystery. We're drawn to that. We learn something about ourselves when we listen to ghost stories, too. But later in the evening, as the fires burn low, that's when the stories become possible. I used to tell my Bolton campers, when I finally had the nerve to try, I would tell them folk tales. I wouldn't only tell them the ghost stories. And, in a way, every story is a kind of a ghost story. Every story is about mystery. All the interesting things happen off stage until they're on stage. Suddenly they heard footsteps. And then when the footsteps arrive, there's another kind of action. A ghost story is all about what's not quite there or what might be coming. And every fairy tale in the world is the same. It's telling you that all the interesting things are yet to come. That's why the hero in a fairy tale is often the third prince or the third princess, the sort of the no-count, in trouble everyday kid who transforms into a hero. But no one sees it until they reveal themselves. It's the hidden, it's the invisible parts that are interesting. It's like peekaboo. When you play peekaboo with a baby, that's like telling a ghost story because the face is hidden. And every little nerve in a baby's body just is yearning for the return of that magical face that poof pops out from behind the curtain of fingers and peekaboo, and the baby's thrilled to bits and then is desperate for the face to disappear again so the whole thing can be repeated. Well, that's like rehearsing to be a listener to a ghost story.
I think you can tell a campfire story so effectively if you're in even the setting of a circle helps a lot because the speaker can make eye contact with everyone. And if the speaker or the teller or the reader, think of yourself as an actor performing a small, short play. One thing I like to keep in mind is start big, start with a bang, get their attention, and then make them laugh, make them cry, but make them wait. Build up that tension with vivid descriptors and not gory. You don't need to go gory. As a matter of fact, if you go gory, really the tale goes off in the wrong direction. You want scary, not gory. You want to build the tension, the eyes of the monster coming at you, or whatever the situation is, or the rustling of the ghost where you could see the grasses move, but there's nothing there. Enhance the tension as much as you possibly can. Speak slowly. Don't rush through the storytelling. Drag it out, make it an event, build that tension. But then when you come to the end of your story, stop. That's the end, stop. And let the silence hang there for a minute. Don't feel all nervous and that you have to fill it in with chatter, and just stop and let the silence hang there. And to me, that's the best way to tell a good campfire story.
My cousin Mark was visiting Toronto a few years ago. He lives in California. And he was out one night. This is what he told me. I didn't see it myself. He was driving on Halloween night. And he was driving along and he passed the corner of Bloor and Yonge. It's a pretty well-known intersection if you're ever in Toronto. And it was around midnight, Halloween night. It was cold, too, that night. He noticed a young woman standing at the corner hitchhiking. Well, my cousin, if you ever met him, he likes girls. He likes women. And he pulled over. He wanted to be helpful. And she was standing in an old-fashioned party dress, hitchhiking. No sweater, no coat, nothing. Just standing there. She looked pretty cold. He pulled over. He says, I'll give you a ride. She got in the car. She was beautiful. And my cousin was real happy to help her out. And he said, hi, my name is Mark. And she said, my name is Charlotte. And he said, where do you live? She said, I live in Scarborough. He said, well, I'm going that way. As a matter of fact, he was living in Etobicoke, but that's the other side of town. He figured he'd just drive her home anyway. And they talked. She was very, very nice. Charlotte was talking to Mark, and he noticed she was so cold. He had the heat turned way up, and she was still shivering. And he said, here, take this jacket. He had a nice greenish, brownish leather jacket. He said, wear this. She put it around her shoulders, and he drove her all the way home. And they had a nice conversation to the point where, so Mark was single at the time, and he started saying, wow, this is nice. And he drove her home. She got out of the car, and as she was leaving, he said, I'd like to see you again if you don't mind. She said, well, why don't you come tomorrow? I'll be waiting for you. Oh, that was wonderful. He watched her go up the stairs into the house. He wrote the address down, and he was driving home when he himself felt a little chilly, despite the heat in the car, and he reached back for his jacket. He didn't have it anymore. He realized she had taken it in with her, which was no problem because he'd get it the next day anyway. So he drove all the way home back to the west side of town. Next morning, it was just a little bit of snow. Sometimes you get snow on November 1st, and he drove all the way back out to visit her. And when he came up to her house, he checked the address, same place, came up, knocked on the door, and an old woman opened up the door. So my cousin said to her, hi, I've come to see Charlotte. The old woman looked a little puzzled, and then she said to my cousin, there's nobody named Charlotte lives here. He said, well, no, I gave a girl named Charlotte a ride here last night. I wrote the address down, and she said I could come and visit. No, the old woman said, nobody named Charlotte lives here anymore. He said to her, what do you mean? She said, well, my daughter was named Charlotte, but she's been gone for 30 years. What happened? He said. Well, she went out to a Halloween party. I told her to wear a sweater, to wear a jacket. Never know what the weather, but no, the weather turned cold. She had left her party. I think she'd had a little too much to drink, and she was waiting for a cab when she slipped on some ice, hit her head, and she never woke up again. She died 3 weeks later. That was at the corner of Bloor Street and Yonge. My cousin was shocked. He heard the story. He said to the woman, I'm so sorry to hear that, and I'm very sorry to disturb you. I'm just wondering, where is your daughter buried? She said, well, she's in Mount Pleasant Cemetery. Thank you, he says. It left the old woman to her grief, and he apologized for coming and interrupting her day. And anyway, he didn't drive home. He drove straight out to Mount Pleasant Cemetery, parked his car, and he was walking through the graves that were 30 years old, and Sure enough, he came to one that had a headstone, said Charlotte. Gave her last name. It said rest in peace and so on. She'd only been about 18 or 19 when she died. A little bit of snow on the ground at this point, and he didn't know what to say or do or think. Anyway, he made a little bit of a blessing or a thank you or something, and he turned to leave. And just before he left, his eye was caught by something sort of greeny brown sticking out of the snow. He walked over, brushed the snow aside, and it was his jacket. He could see that there was a bit of wool and part leather together, and he pulled it out of the ground. Well, it wasn't long after that he told me the story, and I said to him, "Do you still have the jacket?" He said, "Yeah, but I've never worn it since." He said, "What would you wear a jacket like that?" And I said, "Mark, I'm a storyteller. I'm not afraid of ghosts. Of course I'd wear it. Plus I don't have much money. It was a really nice jacket." I said, "I'll wear it." He gave me the jacket. I had it dry cleaned. I've been wearing it ever since. And if we ever have a chance to meet, anybody listening to my story, I will show you the jacket. And that's the story my cousin Mark told me. Well, as a matter of fact, dear listeners, if you Google ghostly hitchhiker or go to the public library, you'll definitely find versions of it. But I think that's also a good story. If you're getting into storytelling, you take that and make it your own. So instead of Young and Bloor, it could be any street corner that you're familiar with. And instead of my cousin Mark, it's your cousin Harry, So that's the nature of a lot of the ghost stories that people tell and have always told, is that they are very adaptable. When you give the demons and the dragons and the monsters shape and a name, you draw them out. You make them more visible and therefore more to scale. I saw that at Bolton Camp when I went. We'd tell these kids stories about the local axe murderer. Okay, the typical summer camp story, and then the kids would go to bed and they'd be real nervous about the story. But in another level, they themselves had witnessed the monster in their own lives. I mean, these were kids who had been through a lot. They'd seen pimps and drug dealers at their street corner. They did not have easy lives. So now they come to camp and they hear a story of the guy out in the forest. And it almost makes them feel like, oh, I'm not the only one who's dealt with a monster. Now I'm hearing a story about the old man Bolton out there with his axe. And in a weird way, it's reassuring to know you're not the only one who's ever had to deal with that scary creature. They dealt with the scary creature in everyday life. And now they're hearing it in the form of a story. I think that ultimately those old-time stories, scary as they are, give kids a sense that they're not alone with their own dragons and demons.
I do a lot of school visits. One of the spin-offs, unintended, very good consequences of my work, is kids around junior high age, reluctant readers, who are reluctant readers, not that all kids of junior high are reluctant readers, but they will pick up my books and read them because the stories are short, they grab their attention. As a result, I do go and visit schools quite a bit. And there is a school in North Edmonton that is a very special school. I would go there often, and I was one of the few authors who would go there. After I had talked to these kids for a length of time, and they were very engaged and interested, one of the teachers came up to me, and she said, "I have a story that you might like to hear." This woman was highly, highly, highly credible. This had happened to her in the gap year between high school and university. She was leaving Lethbridge, and she had a reputation of always being late, and she needed to be in Cranbrook, BC the next day to start work. She left Lethbridge about 10 o'clock at night. Well, it was dark by that time, twilight certainly by that time, because it was right in the middle of summer. And she had to drive through the Crow's Nest Pass, which takes you through the town of Frank, where the Frank Slide occurred in 1906, I believe, or 1904. As she was driving through it, it's a very, very eerie place because the boulders were just left in place and the road has been built around it. And the highway was completely empty, 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night. Nobody else was on the road. She noticed a pair of headlights right behind her, and they were high, really higher than her car. And so she speeded up to get away from the guy, but she wasn't able to. He kept up with her, and he was so close that she could see him in her rearview mirror, and he seemed to be looking over her car as though her car didn't exist. It's all twists and turns and up and down, and she could not lose this guy no matter what she did. She went around a curve and slowed down, and he didn't seem to be there. So she was pleased and relieved. And then she looked to her left, and the place was lit up. There were all floodlights out and these enormous green earth-moving vehicles and people and a flag person standing in the middle of the highway. He directed her to slow and to go to the right. And she said she passed by so close to him that she could have reached out and touched him. She had her windows down. Then she drove through this enormous construction site with all these odd green pieces of earth-moving equipment. She got through, she looked back, the truck had turned off, thankfully, into this. The best anyone can figure is that she experienced retrocognition. She saw this site of the Frank slide as it was a week after the terrible tragedy occurred.
Storytelling is a subversive art form for the times we live in. It's as far from Facebook as you could ever get. It has to be an intimate art. It has to be told by word of mouth to a listener, hopefully someone who will remember your story. And this is how oral tradition has lasted for thousands of years. If you go into indigenous cultures, or back in European culture even too, back to the times of the troubadours, people remembered their stories and they passed them on. And whenever you heard a story, it was understood, it was implicit that you would then be responsible for keeping the story alive, and you would become the custodian of that story. So it became yours for the moment only so that you could pass it on to someone else. You know, we often hear the words of mouth, which is true for storytelling because it's an oral art, but it also is a word of heart. In other words, you have to remember the stories that you're hearing and sharing.
I couldn't let Barbara go without asking, after all her work researching and sharing ghost stories, if she had ever had anything unusual or paranormal happen to her.
In Edmonton, I was sitting in a restaurant waiting for a friend to meet me for lunch. And I always found that the best way to get the good stories was not identify myself. So, I wouldn't say I'm Barbara Smith, author of Ghost Stories of Alberta. The owner, in this case, the owner of the restaurant came over to pour me some coffee. I looked around and I said, boy, this building's really old, eh? Do you think it's haunted? And with that, the lid from the sugar bowl on my table lifted up, moved over, and set itself down. There was a little Frenchman who owned the place, and he was just jumping up and down. And he said, she doesn't usually come out until nighttime. So, of course, when I was doing a radio interview, I talked about that story, and it was a phone-in show. The owner phoned in, and he said, that was because a truck went by just as we were talking, and it vibrated. It wasn't that. It was very distinct movements, an upper movement over and set down. It was a controlled movement. The next caller was one who lived in the area, and he said, no truck went past because that's a no truck zone. I saw what I saw. There's no question about it.
A big thank you to Barbara Smith for joining us. You can find her books virtually everywhere, and she does have a new one coming out this October, just in time for Halloween, which is called Great Canadian Ghost Stories, Legendary Tales of Haunting from Coast to Coast, which is currently available for pre-order on Amazon. An equally big tip of the storyteller hat to Dan Yashinsky. If you're interested in the craft of storytelling, I highly recommend all of his books, but in particular, Suddenly They Heard Footsteps, Storytelling in the 21st Century. His website is Tellery, Tellery.com, and would encourage you to visit that site to learn in particular about his work as a storyteller in residence at Baycrest Health Sciences, working in the palliative care unit there. Some really moving and powerful things he's doing. I would encourage you to check it out. As always, thank you to our tenacious audio editor, Michelle Dennis, and to Kevin McLeod at Incompetech.com for the additional music. For tour information or to buy tickets, be sure to visit our website, hauntedwalk.com, and we would love to connect with you on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk. Be sure to stay tuned for our special mini-episodes starting this month as we swap ghost stories with ghost tour guides from around the world. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.